famous pianist challenged a simple woman to play piano as a joke. Her performance left everyone speechless. Let me tell you something before we start. This is not the kind of story where someone rises from nothing and becomes famous overnight. This is not a rags to riches tale. And honestly, it is not even a revenge story, even though it might sound like one at first. What this really is a story about what happens when the world looks at a quiet person and decides they have nothing to offer, and what that quiet person does in return. Because that is the thing about people who carry something truly special inside them. They do not always feel the need to announce it. They do not walk around with a sign. They do not bring it up at dinner. They just live with it, quietly, the way you live with a fire in a room that no one else has walked into yet. And the fire keeps burning, whether anyone sees it or not, whether anyone comes to warm themselves by it or not. It does not need witnesses. It just burns. This story is about a woman we will call Marta. She was 62 years old at the time. She had gray in her hair and lines around her eyes, the kind that come from years of smiling, and also from years of carrying things you did not let anyone else see. She was not particularly tall. She was not striking in any way that made people look twice when she walked into a room. She dressed simply. She spoke carefully and without too much volume. She was the kind of person who, in a crowded room, tends to drift toward the edges, not because she is uncomfortable, but because the edges suit her. Because she is someone who has always found more comfort in observing than in being observed. She lived in a small town in Hungary, in a house that was not grand but was hers. She had a small kitchen with a wooden table she had owned for 30 years. She had a garden in the back that she was genuinely proud of, full of things she had grown herself. And in the corner of her front room, against the wall where the wallpaper had started to peel a little at the edges from the damp that came in winter, sat an old upright piano. The piano was not beautiful, not in the way a piano in a showroom is beautiful. It had a few keys that stuck when the weather got cold. The finish had worn off in places from decades of use, leaving pale patches that looked almost like snow on dark wood. The pedals squeaked slightly if you pressed it too far down. It had been her mother's piano before it was hers, and before that, it had belonged to someone else entirely, some other family in some other chapter of life that no one in Marta's household remembered anymore. But every single morning, before the rest of the house stirred, before the kettle had boiled, and before the birds had really gotten going outside, Marta would sit down at that piano and play. She played for no one. She played because she could not imagine a morning without it, the same way some people cannot imagine a morning without a walk, or without their first cup of tea, or without sitting for 10 minutes in the quiet before the day begins. The music was not for an audience. It was for her, and for the morning, and for whatever part of her soul needed it that particular day. Some mornings that part of her was joyful, and the music came out bright and fast. Some mornings it was sad, or tired, or searching for something she could not name, and the music reflected that too, slower, more careful, working through something. Her neighbors had gotten so used to it over the years that they did not really hear it anymore. It had simply become part of the sound of that street, woven into the fabric of the morning, the way the train that passed twice before 8 o'clock was woven in, or the way the church bell at 7 was woven in. They had stopped noticing, which, if you sit with that for a moment, is one of the loneliest things in the world, to play something beautiful, day after day, and have the people around you stop noticing entirely, to become background, to become furniture, in a way. But Marta did not play for them either, so she did not mind. Or at least, if some small part of her did mind, she had made peace with it a long time ago, the way you make peace with things you cannot change and would not want to trade away even if you could. To understand what happens at that reception in Vienna, you first have to understand who Marta actually was. Not who she looked like to the people in that room, not the first impression she made, not the story they constructed about her in the seconds after Victor pointed in her direction, who she actually was, which is a different thing entirely, and a thing worth taking the time to know. Marta had been born into a family where music was not optional. Her father played the violin, not professionally but seriously, with the dedication of a man who understood that some things are worth doing properly even when no one is watching and no money is involved. Her mother had taught piano to the children in their village for 40 years. In the front room of their house, one student at a time, 1 hour at a time, patient and exacting, and quietly devoted to the idea that music was not a luxury but a necessity, and that every child deserved access to it, regardless of whether their family could afford much. Music was not decoration in that house. It was like food. You had it every day. You needed it. You did not question why, any more than you questioned why you needed to eat or sleep. It was simply part of what kept you alive in the fullest sense of that word. By the time Marta was 7 years old, her teacher had quietly pulled her mother aside after a lesson and said something that changed everything. She told Marta's mother that her daughter had a gift that she had only seen in a handful of students in her entire career. Not just talent, because talent is common enough, and most children who study seriously show talent of some kind. And not just the capacity for hard work, because that too can be taught and shaped. Something rarer than either of those things. A connection to the music that went deeper than what could be learned. An instinct for the emotional truth of a piece. The ability to hear what a piece was asking for and to give it, almost intuitively, without being told. Her mother listened carefully to all of this, thanked the teacher, drove home, went into the kitchen, and cried quietly for about 10 minutes. Not from sadness. From that particular kind of overwhelm that comes when you realize the child you love is carrying something bigger than your plans for them. Something that will take them, eventually, somewhere you may not be able to follow. By the time Marta was 12, she was performing in local competitions and doing well at them. By 15, she had caught the attention of teachers who worked well beyond her small town. People who traveled in from the nearest city to hear her after word had gotten around. At 17, having prepared for 2 years under the guidance of a new and more demanding teacher, she applied to study at the Franz Liszt Academy of Music in Budapest. If you do not know what the Franz Liszt Academy is, let me explain it simply. It is one of the most prestigious music conservatories in Europe. It has been producing serious musicians for over 150 years. The list of people who have studied or taught there reads like a history of 20th century classical music. It is not an easy place to get into. Most people who are serious enough to apply have been playing for over a decade. Many apply more than once. A significant number never get in at all. Marta got in on her first attempt. She was 17 years old. Those years in Budapest were the most fully alive she had ever felt, and she would say this herself many years later, without bitterness, simply as a factual description of what that time was. She was surrounded, for the first time in her life, entirely by people who understood what music actually was. Not as a hobby you picked up on weekends. Not as a skill parents wanted their children to have for the sake of seeming cultured, but as a whole language, a complete way of existing in the world, as legitimate and as serious as any other. Her professors were demanding in the specific and useful way that only people who genuinely love something can be demanding. They would stop her mid-phrase and say, "No, that is not it yet. You are thinking when you should be listening. Play it again." And she would play it again, and they would stop her again, and she would play it again, until something shifted, until she found the thing they were pointing toward, which was never quite expressible in words and always unmistakable once it arrived. She was not the most technically precise student in her cohort. There were others who had more natural speed, more effortless agility in the fingers, the kind of physical ease that looks like it was simply built into someone at birth. But her professors said something about her that they did not say about all the others, including some of the technically faster ones. They said that when Marta played, you forgot to listen for mistakes. You simply listened. That is a very particular quality, and arguably more valuable than technical perfection, because it is the thing that makes music feel like music rather than demonstration. She graduated with distinction. A concert management company in Vienna had already made contact. There were conversations in progress, measured and careful but genuinely promising, about a debut recital, about recordings, about the kind of future that had begun to feel not just possible but real, the way things feel when they are actually coming together and not just dreamed of. And then her mother got sick. It was not a small sickness. It was the kind that requires someone to be there, not occasionally, not when it was convenient, not on weekends, constantly. It was the kind of illness that unfolds over months, and then years, and that does not care, even a little bit, about your concert dates, or your management meetings, or the fact that you have been building towards something your entire life. Marta went home. She told herself, and she told the management company, and she told her professors who asked, that it would be temporary. She just needed a few months. She would sort things out, get her mother settled with proper help, and then return. They were kind about it. They told her to take the time she needed. They meant it. They were not calculating. Not yet. But a few months became 6, and 6 became a year, and the year became 2, and the conversations with Vienna became less frequent, and then occasional, and then stopped. Not because anyone decided they should stop, but because the space between them had gotten too long and the world had moved on in the way it always moves on, steadily and without cruelty, and without looking back. The people who had been excited about Marta's future were still kind people. They had simply transferred that excitement to other young musicians who were present and available and ready, because the work required that. She understood this. She did not blame anyone for it. She understood that opportunity is not a thing that waits, and that the people who had believed in her had also needed to do their jobs, and that their jobs required working with people who were actually there. Her mother lived for 8 more years after Marta came home. By the time she passed, Marta was 34 years old. She had spent the best part of a decade caring for her mother, and she had done it without resentment, at least not the kind that turns outward and makes others bear its cost. There was a private grief in it, a kind of grief for the version of herself that had been heading somewhere and then had not. But grief and resentment are different things. Grief acknowledges loss. Resentment demands someone to blame. Marta was capable of the first and largely free of the second. She became a schoolteacher. She taught children in the local primary school for 30 years, from the time she was in her mid-30s until she retired at 65. She was good at it. Not famous for it, not written about, but good. The kind of good that shows up in the children who remember her specifically, years later, as the teacher who made them feel capable, as the teacher who had high expectations and also patience and also a kind of warmth that made the expectations feel like a gift rather than a burden. She married a quiet man named, let us say, Andras, who worked at the local post office and who loved her in the steady, undramatic way that some people love, which is the best kind. He did not ask a lot of questions about the version of her life she had not lived. He simply loved the version of her life she was actually living, which is a rare quality in a person and one worth recognizing. He died of a heart attack 11 years ago, in the early morning, quietly, which was in keeping with the way he had done everything. He left her with the house and the garden and the piano and 4 grandchildren she adored. She had lived in every full and honest sense of that word, not the life that had been glimpsed and almost reached when she was 22 and full of forward motion, but a real life. A life with love in it and loss in it and the particular deep satisfaction that comes from doing ordinary things with real care over a long period of time. The piano she still played every morning was what remained of the other version, but she did not think of it that way, exactly. She did not sit down at it every morning as a way of mourning what might have been. She sat down at it because she loved it, and because it still gave her what it had always given her, that feeling of being completely and entirely present, completely awake to the moment, in a way that nothing else quite managed. Something interesting had happened over those 40 years of private playing, something she herself was not fully aware of. Because she played every morning without an audience to impress, without a competition to prepare for, without anyone grading her or comparing her to anyone else, she had played freely. She had played whatever she wanted, in the way she wanted to play it, slowly or quickly, with the pedal or without it, working through a difficult passage 50 times if it took 50 times, letting a beautiful passage breathe as long as it needed to breathe. No one was waiting. No one was watching the clock. No one needed her to be done by a certain measure. And in that freedom, over all those years, the music had grown in her the way roots grow when there is enough soil and enough water and no one pulling at the plant to see if it is ready yet. She had not just maintained what she had continued to develop, quietly and without fanfare, in ways that cannot happen when everything is pointed at performance and outcome and the reactions of others. She did not know this about herself. That is one of the most striking things in the whole story. She had no clear way to know it, because she had no meaningful frame of reference. She played alone in her kitchen, and she thought of herself as a retired musician who still enjoyed playing. That is how she would have described herself if anyone had asked. A retired musician who still enjoys playing. Simple, accurate in the way that leaves out everything important. The evening in Vienna happened because of a very ordinary chain of small events, the kind that feel completely unremarkable as they are occurring, and only reveal their significance in hindsight. Marta's distant cousin, Ilona, worked in the catering department at the Musikverein, which is the famous concert hall in Vienna that has been one of the central buildings of European classical music for over 150 years. Ilona was a practical, cheerful, capable woman who did not know a great deal about classical music, but knew how to work hard and be on time and do what was asked of her well, which had served her for 20 good years in that building. She liked her job, she liked the building. She did not spend a lot of time thinking about the music that happened inside it, but she was aware, in the vague and general way you are aware of things that surround you without quite entering you, that it was significant music. There was a private reception being held on a Tuesday evening in October. It was organized by a foundation that supported classical music education across Europe, and the guest list was what is sometimes called distinguished, which is a word that covers a lot of ground but in this case means wealthy music patrons who funded things, serious music critics who wrote about them, and professional musicians who represented the world those patrons were funding and those critics were writing about. It was not a public event. You did not show up to this unless you were on the list. A guest who had been given an invitation found himself unable to attend at the last moment. He called the foundation. They told him to simply return the invitation. Instead, because he knew Ilona slightly through a mutual friend, he passed it to her, thinking she might enjoy an evening in the building she worked in without working. Ilona accepted it and then, realizing she had already made plans for that evening, thought of Marta, who was visiting Vienna that week to spend time with her grandchildren who lived there. She called Marta on a Tuesday morning. She said, "There is a reception tonight. Music people, nice food. Would you like to go? I have a spare invitation." Marta said yes because she genuinely did enjoy music, and because she had nothing else to do that evening, and because Ilona had emphasized the food, and Marta had not yet had a proper dinner that day. She put on the navy blue dress she had owned for many years. It was clean and well pressed. It fit her properly. But it was not a gown. It was a sensible dress, the kind you buy for occasions that require something better than every day but do not specify exactly how much better. She wore flat shoes because her feet had been bothering her after a long day of walking with the grandchildren. She did her hair simply, the way she always did it. She put on the small silver earrings that had been her mother's. She looked, to anyone who glanced at her when she walked into that reception, like a comfortable older woman who perhaps worked in a school or an office or a library somewhere, someone's mother, someone's grandmother, a person who was very possibly perfectly pleasant and also, almost certainly, had nothing particularly interesting to say about music beyond the ordinary appreciations of an ordinary listener. She looked, in other words, exactly the way the world had been seeing her for 30 years. And she walked into that room and went to stand near the window and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, and she watched the room with the calm, curious attention of someone who is entirely comfortable in their own company, which is its own kind of rare. Now we need to talk about Victor, the famous pianist, because it is not quite fair to tell this story without being honest about who he actually was. Victor was 54 years old. He had been one of the most celebrated concert pianists in Europe for nearly 30 years, which is a long time to be celebrated and a long time to be, in many rooms, the most important person. His recordings had won awards. He had performed at every major concert hall that matters in the world of classical music. He was, within that world, genuinely famous, which is to say he was famous to the people for whom it mattered most to be famous, and largely unknown to everyone else, and he had made a kind of peace with that proportion. He had worked for what he had. That is important to say clearly. He was not a fraud. He had been playing since he was 5 years old. He had sacrificed many of the things that ordinary life offers: the long evenings at home, the flexibility to simply stay somewhere, the texture of a life that is not organized entirely around rehearsal schedules and flight bookings. He had given those things up willingly and consistently for decades. And what he had produced in return was real and earned and genuinely admired by people who knew enough to judge it. But long success does things to a person, and Victor had not been immune to all of them. One of the things it had done was give him a very fast eye for categorizing the people in whatever room he walked into. He had spent decades in rooms where the relevant distinctions were clear, where you could tell very quickly, from the way someone talked about music, or the names they dropped, or the organizations they mentioned, or even simply the confidence with which they moved in a space like this one, whether they were someone worth having a serious conversation with, or someone to be pleasant to briefly before moving on. This is not a completely unreasonable skill to develop when you spend your life in specific professional worlds. Every professional world has its signals, its shortcuts, its ways of reading who belongs and who does not. The problem is when those shortcuts become automatic enough that you stop examining them. When they stop being something you use and start being something that uses you. When you stop noticing that you are making them at all. Victor was a good person who had let a habit get ahead of his awareness. He was not unkind by nature. He did not enjoy making people feel small. But he had gotten comfortable in his reading of rooms, comfortable enough that it no longer occurred to him to question whether a particular reading was correct. He saw what he expected to see. He filed people where they seemed to fit, and then he moved on. That evening he was in a fine mood. The masterclass he had given that afternoon had gone well. He had eaten well. The conversation around him was the kind he enjoyed, substantive and quick, full of people who knew their subject. He had had a glass or two of good wine, enough to soften the edges, to make the room feel warmer, to make him feel generous in the expansive way that a little good wine sometimes produces. He drifted toward the grand piano at the front of the room, because he always drifted toward pianos eventually. It was as natural for him as water finding a drain. He sat down, not because anyone asked him to, but because he was Victor, and there was a piano, and the evening was at the right point for it, and he played. A lyrical piece, intelligent and not showy, calibrated perfectly for the occasion. He had done this many times. He knew exactly how to do it. He played for 5 minutes, and the room quieted around him, and when he finished, the applause was warm and genuine. He stood and smiled, and then, because he was in a good mood and feeling generous, and perhaps because the wine had made him slightly theatrical, he turned to the room and said, "Come on then, who wants a try?" There were knowing laughs from other musicians in the room. There were polite refusals. The moment was beginning to move on, to dissolve back into conversation the way these moments do. And then Victor's eye landed on Marta at the window. He saw a plain older woman in a navy dress with a glass of water, who was not anyone he recognized, and who showed none of the signals he looked for. He took all of this in instantly, in the automatic way he had developed over years, and made his assessment in less time than it takes to describe it. He pointed toward her with an open, theatrical gesture, the kind a performer makes when calling someone up from an audience. Jovial, inclusive, a bit of good-natured theater for the room. "Come, come," he said, loud enough to be heard clearly. "Everyone should have a go. You, madam, come and try." There were a few laughs. Small, reflexive, a little uncomfortable. The kind of laughs that happen when something is framed as entertainment, and people are not quite sure it should be. A few people looked away. A few leaned in slightly, curious about what would happen, and Marta looked at Victor. Then she looked at the piano, and then she set her sparkling water down on the windowsill very carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision, and she walked toward the stage. The room settled into a particular silence. Not respectful quiet. Not yet. More like anticipatory quiet. The kind of quiet that forms when a group of people is collectively bracing for something, though they are not sure for what. A few people, if they are honest with themselves about it, were expecting to be mildly entertained by some good-humored fumbling at the keys. That is not a flattering thing to say about a room full of educated, culturally sophisticated people. But it is the truth, and this is a story about truth. Victor stepped aside to let her sit down. He stood nearby with his arms loosely crossed, a small polite smile on his face. He was not really thinking about what was about to happen. He was already in the next moment of the evening, already running slightly ahead of the present, the way busy and confident people often do. He had made his gesture. Now it would play out, mildly and pleasantly, and they would move on. Marta sat at the bench. She adjusted it slightly, just a small shift, the kind of adjustment you make when you have sat at many piano benches and you know exactly where you need to be. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, not dramatically, not performing anything. She was simply arriving, settling, getting there. She looked at the keys. And then something happened in the room that is very hard to explain, and that many of the people present would try to explain afterward without fully succeeding. Something shifted. Even before her hands touched the instrument, even before she had played a single note, something in the room changed quality. Several people noticed it, though they could not have said exactly what they noticed. One woman who was there said later that it was like the way a room feels when a fire is lit in it, that you feel the warmth before you consciously register that a fire is there. Something that was not there a moment ago is now there, and your body knows it before your mind catches up. But perhaps that is reading backward. Perhaps the room was simply a group of people watching an older woman sit at a piano, and nothing had changed yet at all, and the moment was still entirely ahead of them. Perhaps the before that people remember was colored by the after they lived through. Memory does that. It reorganizes what came before in the light of what came after, so that the before seems to have known all along. What is certain is that she played, and what she played and how she played it is the center of the whole story. She played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, Opus 23. If you are not familiar with this piece, let me spend a moment with it, because you need to understand what it is in order to understand what the room experienced. You need to understand what she chose, and what that choice meant. The Ballade No. 1 is one of the most famous and most demanding works in the entire repertoire for solo piano. It was written by Frédéric Chopin in the early 1830s, and it runs, in performance, somewhere between 8 and 10 minutes depending on the pianist. It is not a short showpiece. It is a full journey, with a beginning and a middle and an ending that is completely unlike any other ending in the classical piano literature. It begins with a single opening phrase, low and slow and serious, that sounds like the start of a story. Not a story that is going to be light, a story that asks you to pay attention, because what is coming is going to matter. That opening phrase is famous among pianists for how deceptively simple it is. There are only a few notes. A child could play them, and yet the way those notes are played, the weight behind them, the timing, the sense of something about to begin, is one of the great challenges of the piece. Most pianists who play the ballade will tell you that the opening is one of the hardest parts to get right, because there is nothing to hide behind. It is just those notes, in the silence, asking to be believed. Then the piece builds. There is a lyrical second theme that is one of the most purely beautiful melodies Chopin ever wrote, and that is saying something, because Chopin wrote almost nothing in his entire life that was not beautiful. That theme is tender and flowing and slightly heartbreaking in a way that is difficult to account for technically. You cannot point to a specific note or a specific interval and say, that is why it is heartbreaking. It just is. It is heartbreaking in the way that certain evenings are heartbreaking, or certain faces, or certain moments that you cannot hold on to no matter how much you want to. The piece moves through these sections with its own internal logic, its own sense of inevitability, and then it arrives at the coda, the ending. And the ending is where the ballade becomes something else entirely. The coda of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 is one of the most famous passages in all of piano music. It is fast and ferocious, and technically demanding in ways that have defeated many very good pianists. But the technical difficulty is not actually the hardest part of it. The hardest part is making it feel inevitable. The piece has spent 8 minutes building to this moment, and the coda has to feel like the only possible way it could end. Not just fast notes arriving because the score says so, but a conclusion that was always coming, that the whole piece was always moving toward. That is both a surprise and something you should have known all along. That sense of inevitability is almost impossible to manufacture. You either find it or you do not. And most pianists, Even very skilled ones do not quite find it. They play the notes correctly, and the notes arrive, and the piece ends, and it is impressive, and it is not quite what it needs to be. To play the Ballade No. 1 well, from beginning to end, in a way that makes a room feel something real, requires not just technical mastery but something deeper. It requires understanding, and understanding requires time, and the kind of time that actually teaches you something is the kind you spend alone with the music, away from anyone else's interpretation of it, discovering what it means to you specifically. Marta had been playing this piece for 40 years. She played it from memory, all 9 minutes of it, without a score in front of her, without any visible effort of recollection. She played the opening phrase, and the room, which had been in that uncertain anticipatory quiet, went fully still. The kind of stillness that is not uncertainty anymore. She played the lyrical second theme, and somewhere in the room, a man who had not cried at music in a very long time felt something move in his chest and was not sure what to do with it. He stood very still and breathed carefully and let it move. She played through the middle sections with the kind of patience that only comes from deep familiarity, allowing the music to take the time it needed rather than pushing it toward the ending. She was not in a hurry. The music was not in a hurry. The room had forgotten to be in a hurry. Victor, still nearby, had uncrossed his arms at some point early in the performance. He had found the nearest empty chair and sat down in it. He was not aware of doing this. It had simply happened, the way sitting happens when your body has made a decision before your mind caught up to it. The music critic in the third row had been holding a notebook. She closed it during the first movement and did not reopen it. The young pianist near the back of the room was holding a glass of wine at an odd downward angle, his arm having slowly lowered as the music progressed, his attention entirely elsewhere. The wine was close to spilling. He did not notice. Someone near him quietly reached over and took the glass from his hand, and he was not aware of that either. Then the coda came. You could feel the room change again when it arrived. Even those who had no technical knowledge of the piece, who were there as patrons or +1s or friends of colleagues, people who liked music without knowing much about it, even those people felt it. You do not need to know the Ballade No. 1 to feel when a piece of music that has been building for 9 minutes finally opens up completely. Your body knows it the same way your body knows when a storm that has been gathering finally breaks. Something releases. Something that was held is let go. And it is enormous. Marta's hands moved through the coda with absolute certainty. Not the certainty of someone pushing through something difficult. The certainty of someone for whom this passage has no more secrets, who has been to every corner of it and knows the path by feel. The notes came fast and full and clear, and the room held its breath for the last 30 seconds of the piece, held it without deciding to, held it the way you hold your breath when you are watching something that you know is almost over and that you do not want to end. And then she played the final chord, and held it, and let it go, and the sound rose and spread and thinned and dissolved into the air of the room, and then there was silence. A real silence. Not the absence of sound exactly, more like the presence of something for which there is no word. The kind of silence that only certain kinds of music can produce, where what just happened has not finished happening yet even though the sound is gone. No one moved, no one spoke. Several people, years later, would say that they lost track of time in that silence, that they genuinely did not know if 3 seconds had passed or 30. Then someone in the back of the room began to clap, and then everyone did. Not the practiced applause of a professional audience at a formal concert, the kind that is well-intentioned and also somewhat automatic. Real applause. Surprised applause. The kind that gets startled out of people who did not come prepared for it, who had budgeted for a pleasant evening and were not expecting to be genuinely moved. Some people were on their feet without having decided to stand. It had just happened. Marta sat for a moment after the sound ended, the way you sit when you have been somewhere and you are returning. Then she stood, smoothed her navy dress with both hands, and gave the room a small, direct nod. Not a performer's bow, not a gesture angled toward an audience, just an acknowledgement. You were here, and I was here, and that was the thing that happened between us. Thank you. She walked back to the window. Victor sat in his chair for a longer time than anyone expected. The people near him were not quite sure what to say. They understood something had happened, something that had rearranged the order of things in the room, and they were not sure of the right words for the moment after something like that. He eventually stood. He crossed the room to where Marta had returned to her spot near the window. She was looking out at the city below, the lit streets, the evening traffic, the same thing she had been looking at when all of this began. He stood beside her for a moment. She turned and looked at him. There was no hostility in her expression. There was no triumph either. There was simply recognition. The recognition of someone who has been seen, clearly and fully, when before they had been looked past. And who is not angry about the looking past, because they have had a long time to make peace with it, and because they were not playing for anyone's approval anyway. He took her hand in both of his. He was quiet for longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "I owe you an apology, and I also owe you a thank you. You gave me the second before I had the chance to offer the first." She looked at him. Her eyes were kind, knowing. The eyes of someone who has lived long enough to understand that people make assumptions they should not, and that what matters is not the assumption, but what a person does when it is corrected, whether they hold the correction or let it go. She said, "It is a beautiful piano," and she turned back to the window. In the following 20 minutes, the room rearranged itself around her in the way rooms rearrange themselves around people who have suddenly become visible. The guests who had laughed at Victor's invitation, or who had braced for an awkward moment, or who had barely registered her presence an hour earlier, now found themselves drawn to her side of the room, not in a crowd, not aggressively, but gradually, curious. A little sheepish, some of them, in the way people get sheepish when they have misjudged something and they know it but cannot quite figure out how to say so. The young pianist from the back of the room came over carefully. He was 28, with a career just beginning and all the confident certainty that youth and early success produce in a person. He introduced himself. He told her he had been working on the ballade himself for 2 years. "How long have you been playing it?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "I first learned it when I was 20, so something like 40 years, off and on, mostly on." He was quiet with that for a moment. "Then, what do you do? Are you a performer?" "I was a schoolteacher," she said, "retired now." He looked at her with the particular expression of someone whose internal picture of things has been directly contradicted by experience, and who has not yet sorted out what to do about it. "But you studied properly," he said. "You must have." She told him about Budapest, about the Franz Liszt Academy, about being 22 and the conversations with the management company in Vienna, and what had seemed, then, like a future that was finally coming into focus. And then about her mother getting sick and going home, and the years that passed, and the career that did not happen in the way it had looked like it would. She told it simply, without drama, without self-pity, in the way that people tell stories they have made peace with. He listened carefully. Then he said, "And you just kept playing? And by yourself, all this time, just for yourself?" "Every morning," she said. "In my kitchen, before the kettle boils." He was quiet again. Then he said something she did not expect. He said, "I think what you just described is the most honest relationship with music I have heard about in my entire career." She looked at him with genuine warmth. "You are young," she said. "You will hear honest things. Pay attention to them." Ilona, Marta's cousin, spent the rest of that evening in a state of quiet and private astonishment. She had worked in that building for 20 years. She had served hundreds of events. She had seen extraordinary musicians on that stage and in this room and in the corridors of the Musikverein, and she had registered them the way you register competence you are not equipped to fully evaluate, with a general sense of quality and not much more. And she had known Marta her whole life, had spent summers at her house as a child, had sat in that kitchen many times as an adult, drinking coffee on weekend mornings while the piano played from the front room, had listened to it with half an ear, the way you listen to the radio when you are thinking about something else, had thought of it as a pleasant background, a habit Marta had, like the garden or the beekeeping, something she did, something she was good at probably, in the vague way that everyone who has done something for 40 years is probably good at it. She had never once really listened. That fact, when it fully settled on her that evening, was more difficult to sit with than the spectacle of what had happened in the room. The spectacle was surprising. What Ilona had missed, for years, in her own cousin's kitchen, was something closer to loss, or at least to the particular shame of recognizing how little attention you paid to something that deserved attention, and how you will never get those mornings back. She told a colleague the next day, still working through it, "I thought it was just something she did, like her beehives. I knew she had been musical when she was young. I did not understand what that meant." That may be the most human sentence in the whole story. Not Victor's assumption, not the room's surprise. Ilona's kitchen, two women drinking coffee, the music coming from the next room, and neither of them saying anything, because they had gotten too used to it to hear it anymore. The music journalist who had been in the third row with her notebook wrote a piece about that evening that was published in an Austrian cultural magazine 2 weeks later. She told me, some time after, that it was one of the hardest pieces she had written in years, not because the facts were difficult, but because the things she was trying to describe kept resisting the language she had available. She wrote about the technical quality of Marta's playing. She wrote about the depth and the certainty of it, and the absence of any performing in it, by which she meant the absence of the layer that most public musicians develop, that small gap between the player and the playing, where you can sense someone managing how it is being received. She wrote that in Marta's playing there was no such gap. The music and the person were simply the same thing for those 9 minutes, and that quality, she wrote, is the rarest thing in music, and the thing that makes the difference between being technically impressive and actually mattering. She also wrote about something harder to name. She called it the particular authority that comes from years of playing with no one watching. She argued that the absence of an audience had paradoxically made Marta's music more present. That when you remove the audience from the equation entirely, when there is no one to please and no reaction to manage and no image to protect, what is left is just you and the music, and that encounter, repeated daily for 40 years, produces something that cannot be produced any other way. The piece was translated and republished in several countries. It spread online in the way that things spread when they touch a nerve that people did not know they had. It was shared by musicians and by school teachers and by people who had given up something they loved for someone they loved and were still not sure if it had been the right thing. It was shared by people who felt invisible in their daily lives, and by people who had misjudged someone and been shown their mistake. It was shared by people who played instruments alone in their houses and had never told anyone they were good at it. Marta did not seek out the piece. Someone showed it to her. She read it once, set it down, said it was very kind, and went back to her garden. Victor did not go home right away after the reception. He went for a long walk, which was not something he did often. He was not someone who spent a great deal of time alone, or sought it out, or felt comfortable in it. His life was structured around other people, around collaborators and audiences, and the conversation and the forward motion that his career required. But that evening he walked for an hour through the lit streets of Vienna, alone, thinking. He thought about the moment he had pointed at her. He ran it back in his mind and looked at it honestly, without the protection of reframing it as generosity, or good humor, or theater. He had seen an ordinary-looking woman and made an instant decision about her, and then performed on the basis of that decision, and the decision had been wrong, and the evidence of how completely wrong it was had sat at the piano and spent 9 minutes making that evident to everyone in the room. He was a man who had prided himself, quietly, on his judgment, on his ability to read rooms and people quickly and accurately, on knowing what was what and who was who. And what that evening had shown him was that his quick judgment, in at least this one instance, and possibly in others he had no way to audit, had been not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. That the machinery he had trusted so completely had produced such a faulty result that it had been corrected, publicly and completely, in front of a room full of his peers. He thought about all the other rooms he had walked through over 30 years with that same machinery running, all the other people he had looked at quickly and filed and moved on from. How many of those readings had been accurate? How many had been as wrong as this one, and he had simply never been shown? It was not a comfortable walk. But he completed it. He went home and he sat at his own piano, a beautiful instrument in his apartment, and he played for a long time without planning to, just played, trying to find his way back to something he had not thought about in a while. What it felt like before the audiences and the reviews and the recordings and the management and all the rest of it. What it felt like when the music was just the music, and he was just himself, and there was no one to be impressive for. He found it, eventually, or something like it. A phrase he played that felt true in a way that did not have anything to do with anyone else's reaction. He stayed with it. He played it again. Several months later, he organized a benefit concert for music education programs in rural areas of Hungary and other parts of Central Europe. In the program notes, he wrote a short reflection, not long, because he was not someone who needed to say a great deal to say something. He wrote that the most extraordinary musician he had encountered in a decade had not been on any stage he had planned to visit. He wrote that talent does not require an audience in order to grow, and that humility is not something that belongs only to people who have not yet succeeded, but something that requires maintenance from everyone, at every level, for as long as you are practicing anything that matters. He wrote that he had been corrected, in October, in a way he had needed for a long time, and that the correction had been given without any intention of correcting him, which made it all the more complete. He did not name her. She had asked him not to. He had called her before the concert to ask if he could mention her, and she had said she would rather he did not, that the music was the point, not her story around it. He had smiled on the phone. He said, "Of course, that is exactly what a musician says." She said, "That is what anyone would say if they had thought about it." He had laughed, genuinely, and then been quiet for a moment, and then thanked her. She thanked him back. They ended the call. Marta declined every interview request that came through after the story spread. She was not rude about it. She thanked people for their interest and explained, politely and simply, that she had nothing to add that the music had not already said, and that she preferred to keep her mornings to herself. The radio station in Vienna sent a very kind letter. She wrote back thanking them and declined. Her granddaughter, who was 16 and had grown up partly in Vienna and had all the particular confidence of someone who is 16 and has access to the internet, sat with her grandmother one afternoon in the kitchen and could not leave it alone. "Why won't you do it?" she said, not unkindly, but with genuine bafflement. "You could be known. People could hear you, properly hear you, not just one room." Marta looked at her granddaughter with the kind of fondness that is also a little amused. She thought about how to say this in a way that was real and not too long. "People heard me," she said, "in that room. That was real. But it could be more people." "More is not always more," Marta said. "When I play in the morning, it is mine. It is between me and the music gets everything I have. If I start playing for an audience, even a kind audience, even an audience that wants good things for me, something changes. Some of my attention goes to them. Some of what I give goes toward how it is landing, toward whether it is working, toward the response. And what I have to give the music becomes a little less." She paused. "I do not want to give it less. I have been giving it everything for 40 years. I would like to keep doing that." Her granddaughter sat with this. She did not immediately argue, which for a 16-year-old is actually significant. Then she said, "But doesn't it feel like a waste sometimes, that all those people can't hear you?" Marta thought about this honestly. "Sometimes, when I was younger, maybe. But I have had a long time to think about it." She refilled her tea. "Here is what I think. The music does not need to be heard by many people to be real. It is real when I play it. It is real when it is true. Whether one person hears it or 1,000, it was the same music. It was played with the same attention. It meant the same thing. The audience does not determine the value of the thing. The thing determines the value of the thing." Her granddaughter looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I am going to think about that for a while." "Good," said Marta. "It is worth thinking about. There is one last thing to tell you, and it is the simplest thing in the whole story, the most ordinary thing, which is, I think, what makes it the most important." 2 weeks after the reception in Vienna, Marta took the train home. She unlocked her front door and set her bag in the hallway. The house had that particular smell it gets when you have been away for a week, slightly still, slightly closed in on itself. She opened a window in the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She walked into the front room. She looked at the old upright piano in the corner, with its worn finish and its few sticky keys, and the small gouge in the side panel that had been there since before her memory of it began. She looked at it the way you look at something that has been your companion through the longest part of your life. She sat down on the bench. She adjusted it slightly, just a small fraction, the way she always did. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment. She looked at the keys, and she played. Not Chopin, not anything grand or finished or ready for an audience. She played something she had been working on for the past several months, a piece by a Hungarian composer she admired, something that had been living in her hands but was not quite settled yet. The third section had a passage that she had not fully understood yet. She knew it was not quite right because it did not feel inevitable. It felt deliberate in a way that it should not. She needed to find what was underneath it. She played it slowly. She played it again. She stopped at the difficult passage and worked it carefully, the way you work something you respect and are patient with. She tried one approach and listened to it, then another. She went back to the beginning of the section and played it in context. She found something, a small shift in the timing of the left hand, that opened the passage slightly. She played it again with the shift. Better. Not there yet, but better. The kettle had boiled and she had not gone to make tea yet. The morning light was doing what October morning light does in a small Hungarian town, coming in at a low angle through the front windows, pale and specific, making the room look both older and more itself. She played for an hour, maybe a bit more. She lost track, which is one of the things that happens when you are doing something you love with your full attention. Then she went and made her tea. On the street outside, people walked past on their way to the market or to work. They heard the piano from inside the house. Most of them did not consciously register it. It was just the sound of that particular house, on that particular street, the way it had been for years. A few of them had a vague awareness of it, a pleasant background note in the morning, nothing more. None of them knew anything that had happened in Vienna. It would not have changed anything if they had, because Marta was not playing for them. She never had been. She was playing for the music, and for the morning, and for whatever part of herself needed it, which was the same part that had needed it every morning for 40 years. And it was enough. It was entirely, completely enough. It always had been. I want to say one last thing before this is over, because I think it is the thing the story is really trying to say, underneath all the other things it is saying. We live in a world that is very good at measuring certain kinds of value, the kind that is visible, the kind that has an audience, the kind that can be documented, shared, streamed, counted, and compared. We are very good as a culture at recognizing the person who is seen, the person on stage, the person with the recorded output and the quantifiable reach and the professional credentials and the publicly legible story of achievement. What we are much less good at is recognizing the value of what happens away from all of that, the person who has gotten extraordinary at something over decades of private practice, with no audience to validate it, and no metric to confirm it, and no public event to make it legible to the world. The person who has kept faith with something beautiful for its own sake, for the sake of what it gives them, without ever needing anyone else to know about it. That kind of value is real. It is arguably more real, more purely real, than the kind that depends on being watched, because it does not depend on anything outside itself. It is complete in its own terms. Marta's music in her kitchen every morning was not a rehearsal for the thing that happened in Vienna. It was the thing. The thing in Vienna was almost accidental, a glimpse that the world happened to get of something that was already fully itself, already complete, already everything it needed to be. The world's glimpse did not make it more valuable. It just made it visible. And the lesson, if there is one, is simply to be more careful about where we look, and what we assume, and who we move our eyes past without stopping. To be more careful about the ordinary-looking people near windows at parties. To be more careful about the sounds we have gotten so used to that we stopped hearing them. To be more careful, all of us, about the fires we cannot see because we have not yet walked into the room.